The glass walls of a midtown restaurant reflected restless city light as Ethan Caldwell sat alone at a corner table, his phone vibrating with bored messages, demanding a public partner proof of stability, proof of image, proof that a trillion-dollar AI empire was somehow safe in his solitary hands. Across the room, Lila Monroe balanced 3 plates with practiced calm, her dark eyes scanning tables with quiet intelligence that no one ever noticed, because at Manhattan midnight, no one looked at waitresses as minds, only as moving parts in a machine that demanded speed, obedience, and invisibility. Tonight, silently, Ethan noticed her because she did not move like the others, not rushed, not frantic, but deliberate, calculating distance and timing with unsettling precision. And when she met his gaze for a brief second, he felt the strange discomfort of being seen through layers he never showed anyone ever. The board had issued its final warning that morning dinner party tomorrow partner required investors watching, rumors spreading, and for the first time in his life, no amount of money or code could manufacture the illusion they wanted, leaving him stranded in a city of 8 million with no one. When Lila reached his table, he watched the slight tension in her shoulders as she placed his coffee down, a detail too controlled for exhaustion, and without fully deciding to do it, he spoke the sentence that would shatter both of their lives into a different future tonight, forever. He asked how much she earned in a night, and when she answered with quiet honesty, his jaw tightened because the number sounded like an insult beside his bank balance. Then he said, $10,000 for one evening, sit beside me at my dinner party, speak if spoken to. For a moment the restaurant vanished, and she heard only the echo of unpaid bills, a father who vanished under debt, a mother buried by hospital fees, and a UCLA classroom she had abandoned with numbers still burning behind her eyes. Yet humiliation rose faster than temptation and instinct refusal. She told him the offer was degrading, that she was not for rent, but her hands trembled around the tray, because desperation has its own gravity, and Ethan saw the conflict the same way he read: collapsing markets, pride fighting survival, emotion oscillating between defiance and fragile surrender in time. Minutes later she returned and accepted without bowing, without smiling, only stating the conditions of silence with cold clarity, as if sealing a contract she despised. And when Ethan gave a stiff nod, he did not realize he had just hired the silent one person capable of dismantling his world alone. As she walked back into the dark Manhattan street with $10,000 promised, but no safety guarantee, Lila did not yet know this was the night that would rip open every hidden wound in his controlled existence and force both their lives into collision, destruction, and rebirth under light. Ethan sat alone after she left, the coffee cold, the contract unspoken yet binding, and for the first time in years he felt something beyond pressure and control, a faint unease that this decision was not a transaction but a fracture in the careful geometry of his life somehow. Across the city, Lila climbed 4 flights of cracked concrete stairs to her apartment, counting each step like an equation, with no margin for error, and when she locked the door behind her, the silence pressed in with the weight of every risk she had ever taken and chance denied. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and opened her laptop to numbers she still studied in secret regression models, scribbled beside overdue notices, proof that her mind had never stopped, even when the world had closed its doors. And tonight she had chosen the most dangerous variable. The next 24 hours loomed like a cliff edge for them both, one trapped by reputation and power, the other by hunger and memory, and neither understood yet that the dinner party meant to hide his weakness would become the place where every illusion he lived by starts collapse. In a penthouse of glass and silence, Ethan prepared for war with investors and cameras, rehearsing answers he did not believe, while his reflection judged him without mercy. And somewhere below, Lila washed grease from her hands as if trying to scrub away fear itself before stepping into a world. Neither of them slept that night, bound by $10,000 and an unspoken challenge, unaware that what awaited them was not simply a performance for the wealthy but an execution ground for masks, lies, and pride, and that by sunrise, Waitress and the Billionaire would no be strangers. Lila woke before her alarm in the pale blue darkness of early Manhattan morning, with the weight of 10,000 invisible dollars pressing against her chest like a promise and a threat at the same time, and for several seconds she forgot where she was until the cracked ceiling and the distant sirens reminded her that this was still her world and not the glass and marble fantasy she had agreed to enter tonight. She rolled onto her side and stared at the single chair, where her only formal dress hung like a borrowed identity, the fabric slightly worn at the hem from a life she had never lived and never been invited into. In the quiet she felt the old ache of UCLA classrooms, the glow of projector screens, equations unfolding like living organisms, the professors who said she had one of the sharpest analytical instincts they had ever seen, and the moment she packed her books into a cardboard box because brilliance does not pay tuition when the bank account is empty. She stood slowly, as if the floor might give way under the weight of choice, and brewed cheap coffee that tasted like metal and resolve, while scrolling through her bank app that still glowed red with overdue reminders and invisible walls. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell woke in silence above the clouds in a penthouse, where glass framed the skyline like a possession, and the automated system whispered good morning, as the curtains withdrew with mechanical obedience, revealing a view people would sell years of their lives to stand inside. For 5 minutes. He did not stand at the window this morning. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed with his phone in his hand, reading the last message from the board, reminding him of tonight and of everything at stake if he walked into that room alone again. He showered in water that fell like rain without temperature shock, and dressed in layered restraint, dark suit, ordinary cut, expensive fabric, the uniform of a man who needed to look stable and unremarkable while carrying the weight of billions. In the mirror, he examined the faint bruise of exhaustion under his eyes, and tightened his jaw until it vanished because investors could smell weakness faster than blood. By afternoon, Lila stood in her apartment, adjusting her dress again and again, until the mirror blurred from motion, her hands shaking not with nerves but with adrenaline she did not know how to release, as she twisted her hair into a shape that belonged to someone else and painted her lips with the last of a budget lipstick that felt like a costume rather than a choice. She practiced breathing slowly because panic ruined posture, and posture decided everything in rooms where people measured worth by how much space you dared to take. The doorbell rang exactly at 7, and when she opened it, the hallway filled with Ethan Caldwell, as if wealth had learned how to take human form. His suit elegant in a way money teaches without shouting, his face unreadable in the way it had been the night before. He looked her over once with precise calm, noting not beauty but alignment, symmetry, readiness, the same way he evaluated code that might crash a system. "You are punctual," he said, which was not a compliment but a data point, and she stepped into the hallway with her back straight and her fear sealed behind still eyes. The car ride unfolded in tense, quiet city lights, sliding across the black glass like fragments of another life, while he reviewed figures on his phone, and she watched crowds on sidewalks moving with the careless freedom of people who did not know worlds could vanish in one night. 3 rules, he said, without looking at her, keeping his voice low and neutral. You stay close, you do not volunteer information, and you let me speak when necessary. She nodded without argument, storing each word as an experiment variable, rather than a command, because she was not entering a dinner, she was entering a closed system under distortion. At the hotel, the air changed immediately, the scent of polished stone and controlled wealth pressing into her senses, as doors opened to a lobby that swallowed sound and replaced it with hushed authority, and as they entered the ballroom she felt the invisible shift where the room decided who mattered. Before they spoke, crystal lights scattered across black suits and silk dresses, as servers moved like silent equations along the perimeter, while at the center clusters of power leaned together in murmurs that reshaped markets and careers in real time. Ethan placed a guiding hand at the small of her back to steer her toward the main table, and she resisted the urge to shrink from the contact, because it was not possessive but procedural, like moving a pawn into position before the game began. Names drifted past her, like currency she was not allowed to touch: hedge fund titans, pharmaceutical heirs, data magnates, venture capital architects, and when they reached their seats, the room adjusted subtly as eyes shifted toward the unknown variable at Ethan Caldwell's side. He introduced her only as Lila, without a last name, without context, and she felt the precision of that omission land, like a cool blade separating her from meaning in this world. Conversation unfolded around them with careful laughter and coded phrases: growth projections, acquisition windows, workforce optimization, delivered with smiles that never reached the eyes. Plates arrived layered with artistic excess, and she held her fork the way she had learned to hold confidence at UCLA, steady, controlled, ready to penetrate complexity. When labor came up, it was as an abstraction: numbers of reduction, gains of efficiency, bodies erased into decimals, and she felt heat rise behind her ribs with each casual equation that converted living humans into surplus lines. Once she met Ethan's gaze and saw his attention remained fixed on the flow of dialogue, not in approval but in concentration, and the realization cut sharply that stability for him was not an emotion but a survival algorithm. A man across the table finally turned his attention fully to her, his smile indulgent and dismissive, and asked what she thought of these matters, as if expecting boredom or polite ignorance, and she felt the pressure of Ethan's rule pull tight around her throat. Silence stretched as everyone waited for the decorative element to either malfunction or disappear. She could have obeyed and smiled and preserved the illusion, but something inside her fractured at the casual contempt, and the memory of every closed door, and every professor who had said she belonged somewhere greater, surged through her, with a force that made obedience feel like betrayal. She spoke carefully at first, questioning a projection about attrition rates, pointing out a variable oversight with gentle precision, as if offering a small correction rather than an attack. But the moment the numbers shifted under her logic, the room tilted toward her attention, sharpening with interest and disbelief. Ethan turned his head slowly, and for the first time that evening, she saw something break through the control, a flicker of alarm that was not statistical. She continued describing patterns she had mapped in her spare hours, trends she had seen buried under impressive surface growth, by those who benefited from not looking too closely, and with each sentence the tension rose like electricity under glass. Some faces tightened, others leaned forward drawn by the disturbance, but none interrupted because disruption carried its own authority. When she stopped, the room held its breath, and then one man at the far end nodded, once slowly, not in approval, but in recognition, as if he had just confirmed the presence of another mind operating at their level. Ethan felt the board far away across the city with their demands, and his illusion of control dissolve into unease, because the variable he thought he had purchased for appearance had just revealed unknown depth. For the rest of the evening, she said little again, but the dynamic had changed. Eyes followed her with analytical curiosity, and Ethan answered questions with a new stiffness born of recalibration, because the system he had built no longer behaved as predicted. When the dinner ended, the applause came for him as always measured dutiful, but the deeper resonance remained fixed on her, and as they walked back through the floating light of the hotel foyer, neither spoke because words would have acknowledged the fracture, and neither was ready. In the car she stared out the window again, but the city no longer looked the same, and Ethan drove with both hands on the wheel as if grounding himself to a reality that had subtly tilted. Outside her building, she paused with her hand on the door and felt the urge to look back to search his face for meaning, but instinct warned her that understanding him too soon would be dangerous. She stepped into the night alone, and the city swallowed her as it always had, yet tonight, it felt as if she had left something of herself behind in a room she was never meant to enter twice. In the quiet that followed, Ethan remained in the car long after the driver had started, the engine again, staring ahead, as if the glass were not transparent anymore, but reflective, and the image looking back unsettled him in ways numbers never could. The second dinner arrived not as an invitation but as an expectation sealed by reputation and wealth, and when the black car stopped in front of the private estate overlooking the Hudson River, Lila felt the same invisible weight settle onto her shoulders that had pressed there the first night, except now it was heavier because this time everyone knew she was not invisible anymore. Inside the estate, the wealth was louder, chandeliers bled into marble columns, and voices overlapped in calculated cheer, designed to sound spontaneous, while every laugh carried a price. Ethan walked at her side with the same controlled precision, as always, yet the tension between them moved differently, now less like a contract and more like a wire pulled tight between two charged points. At the entrance, a host greeted Ethan by name with respect, polished to a mirror shine, and glanced at Lila, only long enough to measure her suitability against the room. She was not introduced with context again, only with her first name, and again the omission fell, like a quiet sentence of exclusion, that marked her as temporary even after what she had done. The table they were guided to was larger than before, and the faces around it older, sharper, threaded with authority built over decades of accumulation and loss. Conversation lifted immediately around quarterly earnings and speculative pipelines, while staff moved like shadows, delivering plates with surgical silence. Lila took her seat beside Ethan, feeling the subtle recalibration as eyes examined her dress, her posture, her restraint, this time less amused and more alert. The mistake she had made was already circulating as rumor, and rumors made good bait. Someone to her left commented on the volatility of labor markets in coastal cities, and another responded with practiced amusement about replacing high-cost workers with automated solutions, as if human redundancy were a mild inconvenience, rather than a moral decision. Lila felt the sting again, not personal alone, but as an equation she knew too well, one where variables called people vanished into profit margins that glowed clean and righteous on projection screens. Ethan listened with the same stillness, but the quiet around him was different from agreement now. It felt like containment. A man seated across from them leaned forward with a polite smile, so refined it looked carved, and asked Lila if she enjoyed working in New York, as if she were a novelty invited to report on street life for the entertainment of wealth. She answered that she worked nights and studied during the day, which was true in the most essential sense, and the man laughed softly as if she had delivered a charming anecdote rather than a testimony of survival. Then someone else asked whether she planned to remain in service work long-term, as if destiny were a ladder visible only to those with the privilege to decide when to climb. The word service echoed in her mind, and she held her expression neutral, because neutrality was safety even in rooms where conversation cut like glass under velvet. Ethan shifted slightly beside her, a marker she had learned to read as rising irritation, but he said nothing, and the silence allowed the narrative to continue shaping her into what they preferred. She be an accessory, proof of benevolence, proof of reach, proof of how far their world could extend, downward, without ever touching consequence. When a discussion turned toward restructuring in healthcare data, a woman beside Lila remarked casually that frontline workers were replaceable costs, and that loyalty was an outdated liability, and this time the casual cruelty tore past restraint. Lila felt the moment stretch as every part of her mind measured risk and inevitability, and she remembered the day her mother had been sent home from the hospital because an insurance algorithm classified treatment as non-essential. Her voice entered the space quietly at first, not as a challenge but as an inquiry, asking which datasets they used to determine replaceability and whether long-term patient outcomes were included in workforce optimization models. The question stalled the flow like sand in a mechanism, and several people turned toward her with surprise that edged into irritation. Ethan felt the shift immediately and placed his glass down slowly, eyes tightening not in fury but in calculation, as the room prepared itself for a disturbance again. The woman who had spoken replied with polite condescension that methodology was proprietary, and that frameworks were sufficiently robust to anticipate human behavior with high confidence. Lila nodded as if accepting the premise, and then asked whether those frameworks accounted for nonlinear stress accumulation in caregiving professions and the delayed cost spikes associated with burnout-induced errors. This time the disturbance spread outward, a ripple through the table of people unaccustomed to having underlying assumptions interrogated by someone they had already categorized as disposable. She cited studies with the precision of memory, not performance, referencing sample sizes, confidence intervals, variance, asymmetry, and long-tail consequences, as naturally as if she were back in a UCLA lecture hall, where minds were valued for friction rather than compliance. Silence returned, thicker this time, burdened by the uncomfortable recognition that data itself had been turned back on its creators. A professor of biostatistics, recently retired from federal advisory work, sat at the far end of the table and finally broke the silence, not with dismissal but with curiosity, asking where she had learned to speak this way about system behavior in human networks. Lila hesitated, knowing that truth would shift the entire narrative beyond recovery, yet the moment demanded coherence, not concealment, so she answered that she had studied statistics and data science before she ran out of money. The admission cracked through the room sharper than any insult, and for a breath the careless laughter of power stalled under the weight of exposed waste. Ethan felt something twist, not pride, not anger, but a deeper unease as he realized the room he thought he controlled had turned on a vector he did not design. The professor nodded once slowly, and said that what she described aligned precisely with the emerging failures his research team had observed in national healthcare performance models. And for several minutes the table fell into genuine discussion without metaphor and without disguise. Lila answered questions directly, sometimes stumbling, sometimes correcting herself, never performing perfection, only clarity earned through obsession and loss. Ethan watched every exchange with an expression that masked turbulence, because no variable in his strategic framework accounted for a waitress altering the trajectory of a room built to deny her. When the discussion finally drifted back toward safer territory, the shift felt artificial, as if something real had been temporarily allowed into an aquarium of glass and then sealed back out. The rest of the evening treated her differently now, not kindly but cautiously, as though she had gone from decoration to anomaly, a statistical outlier that could not be dismissed without cost. When the car ride began again, the silence was not empty but saturated, and when Ethan finally spoke, his voice carried an edge she had not heard before, asking why she had not mentioned her background. She replied that he had not asked, and neither of them missed the deeper question buried beneath the exchange. In the space between buildings and moving light, both understood that she was no longer merely seated beside him. She had entered the architecture of his world, whether he invited her or not. The boardroom overlooked the East River like a throne of glass and steel, and as Lila walked in behind Ethan, she felt the familiar pressure of entering a place where decisions rearranged thousands of lives with the tap of a finger and the lift of an eyebrow. This was not the private dinner table of murmurs and coded contempt. This was open daylight power, polished, raw, and merciless. The meeting was scheduled as a routine data integrity review, yet everyone in the room understood why she was there. Even if no one had said it out loud, an anomaly had appeared at the edge of their system, and anomalies demanded classification, correction, or elimination. Lila took the seat assigned far from the head of the table, a placement that communicated rank before language ever could, and she noted it calmly, as another variable in an environment that thrived on hierarchy like oxygen. Ethan began the meeting with practice neutrality, outlining quarterly performance, predictive accuracy of their healthcare AI platforms, and upcoming contracts in 3 states where hospitals had essentially outsourced life and death to algorithms built in his laboratories. The first objections came from compliance officers, citing regulatory pressure and data access restrictions, the type of concerns designed to slow discomfort without changing direction, and Lila listened carefully, tracking not only words but gaps where numbers hid consequences. When a senior investor challenged Ethan about model bias, risk escalating into public scrutiny, she felt it again, the invisible thread connecting them, pulling tighter, as if the entire room held its breath around an unspoken test. Ethan answered with technical language, citing validation layers, redundancy, stress testing, margin, safety factors, all true and all insufficient, because none addressed the human variable she knew too well. A director from the West Coast leaned back and said plainly that public trust no longer mattered if market dominance was secured, and that early backlash always faded once dependency was established. The statement hung raw and exposed, and Lila felt heat cross into resolve as the point of no return approached with mathematical inevitability. She looked to Ethan and saw the signal he never meant to give her, a subtle tightening at the jaw that whispered, "Do not speak." The room waited, waiting to see if the outlier would collapse back into silence or expand again into disruption. When she spoke this time, there was no softness in it, because the moment did not permit it. She addressed the room directly, stating that their predictive models failed under extreme socioeconomic stress conditions, and that recent national trends had created precisely those conditions across multiple patient populations. Someone interrupted to question her authority, but she continued through the interruption with clarity hardened by years of calculating consequences in spaces where empathy was dismissed as inefficiency. She explained that error rates spiked not because of faulty coding but because of insufficient adaptive response to cascading risk variables that no revenue model accounted for because they unfolded outside quarterly reporting windows. She cited internal performance logs none of them realized she had accessed because she had spent nights teaching herself their proprietary structure while cleaning tables for strangers who would never know her name. Screens lit as she displayed failure probability curves, the lines bending upward with quiet inevitability, and one by one the room shifted from dismissal to unease. A compliance officer finally asked how she had obtained the internal data, and she answered with unapologetic honesty that she had learned their system and asked for read access, and no one had thought to deny a Waitress documentation, credentials. The admission cut deeper than any accusation, and for a moment the concept of security itself felt fragile under the weight of what she had exposed. Ethan watched the unfolding cascade with a mind that had calculated wars of capital yet had never prepared for this variable, a truth delivered without permission by the last person the system would ever anticipate as an adversary. She did not accuse, she demonstrated, and with each projected curve, the cost of ignoring her grew more visible than any moral argument could render. A senior architect attempted to reframe the metrics as hypothetical, but she presented live patient outcome correlations tied to the very hospital networks their expansion plan targeted. The silence that followed was not shock alone but recognition of consequence creeping out from behind abstraction. The biostatistics professor rose from his seat not to challenge, but to confirm, and validated her methodology line by line with professional rigor and the authority of decades in the field. And when he finished, the room no longer saw a disruption, they saw a fault line running straight through their empire. Ethan felt the room reorient around her with frightening speed, the gravitational pull of undeniable precision, eclipsing every doubt faster than he could adjust. And in that moment, power moved from ownership to intellect before his eyes. The board chair finally asked her directly what she recommended, and for the first time since entering that world, she felt the full weight of decision, not as an indulgence of speech but as an obligation carrying measurable lives behind it. She proposed an adaptive recalibration of their model architecture that slowed expansion but stabilized outcome variance over long horizons, and she acknowledged the profit deceleration openly because hiding cost was a habit she had seen destroy everything she ever loved. The proposition landed with resistant force, and argument returned sharp and immediate, citing delayed ROI, shareholder reaction, valuation constraints, and she answered each with operational alternatives, stage deployment frameworks, and loss smoothing that preserved both life and capital with disciplined compromise. She did not promise perfection, she offered survivability, and survival sounded radical in boardrooms addicted to dominance. When the chair finally called a temporary recess, the room fractured into clusters of rapid whispered debate, and Lila remained seated, suddenly aware of how alone she was inside the impact she had delivered. Her hands trembled now that the inertia had broken, and she pressed them into her lap, to still the evidence of human cost beneath intellectual victory. Ethan stood beside her without touching her and spoke quietly, not as CEO, but as a man who had just watched a stranger become a force inside his architecture, asking how far she had planned to take this, and she answered him honestly that she did not plan anything, she simply could no longer tolerate silence where the cost of silence was counted in human beings. His gaze shifted then, not with dominance but with something like dawning respect edged by fear, because systems he commanded could be rebuilt, markets could be calmed, but a mind like hers could not be unmade once it had been released. When the board reconvened, the tone had altered noticeably, and concessions appeared framed as strategy rather than retreat, and a provisional task force was formed to investigate the modifications she proposed, with the professor appointed as advisor and Ethan as overseer. The shift was not yet victory, but it was irreversible motion, and everyone in the room understood that the future path had bent in a way that could not be restored to its original curve. As the meeting adjourned, investors cast looks at Lila that ranged from appraisal to resentment, and she felt the sting of exposure settle into her bones, because visibility carried its own danger in worlds that punished deviation even when it delivered truth. Outside the building, she stood alone on the steps as traffic roared past like an indifferent river, and the enormity of what she had just done pressed down with sudden gravity. Ethan joined her without preamble, and for the first time since they met, there was no contract between them, no invisible transaction, only the shared shock of consequence hanging thick between words. He told her that she had just altered the internal balance of his company in ways the board would not forgive lightly, and she responded that perhaps forgiveness was not the metric that mattered. He looked at her then with an intensity that stripped away the last layer of distance, and she saw not the billionaire or the CEO, but a man confronting the collapse of certainty and the rise of something he could not dominate. The city continued around them, unknowing, impatient, and relentless as always, but neither of them moved yet, because the world they had entered together no longer obeyed familiar code, and for the first time, the waitress and the billionaire stood on equal ground in a war defined not by wealth, but by intellect. The formal offer arrived 3 days after the boardroom fracture, in a thin white envelope left at the security desk of the diner where Lila worked the night shift, and when her name was called, she felt an instinctive tightening in her chest, because nothing good ever arrived quietly in her life. Inside was an interview request from Ethan Caldwell Own Corporation, simple language, heavy implication, and her hands shook as she folded the paper into her apron like it might vanish if she looked at it too long. The following 48 hours passed in fragmented sleep and restless thought as memory fought hope with equal violence, reminding her how many doors had opened just far enough to let light in before slamming shut. At the appointed hour, she stood again in front of the same glass tower, this time alone, no borrowed suit, no guiding hand, only the worn confidence she had built in the dark years after UCLA. The interview was not conducted as a test but as an observation room, filled with men and women trained to measure deviation and risk, and Lila answered without ornament because ornament had never saved her before. They questioned her not about formal credentials but about boundaries of systems, about ethical failure points, about long-term data integrity under political pressure, and she spoke as someone who had studied collapse up close, not from textbooks alone. When it ended, there was no applause, no reassurance, only a narrow silence heavy with evaluation. That evening, Ethan summoned her not to the diner or the penthouse, but to his private office far above the city, where glass erased the boundary between floor and sky. He did not invite her to sit at first, and the power of that pause was not lost on her, because silence was still his chosen architecture of control. He told her the board wanted her inside the company officially, as an analyst under provisional authority, and her breath caught because opportunity had a voice now, and it sounded like everything she had buried for survival. Before she could answer, he added a second statement that dropped heavier than the first. He offered her $50,000 to decline the position and walk away with no future involvement in his company. The room tightened around them as if the air itself recoiled from the bluntness of the choice, and she understood instantly that this was not a bribe for silence, but an attempt to restore the geometry of his world to a form he could still recognize. Money had always been the solution he applied when variables misbehaved, and he offered it now with a steady hand as if correcting a small misalignment in code. Lila felt the old hunger awaken briefly, the hunger that remembered empty refrigerators and overdue rent, and a mother who measured medication doses like currency, and for a terrifying second, the number almost conquered everything she had ever believed about herself. Then, she remembered the boardroom, the graph lines bending under her hands, the professor eyes lighting with validation, the tremor in Ethan's control, when the truth slipped beyond his reach, and she felt something else rise higher than need. She told him she would not take the money, because the offer was not about opportunity, it was about erasure, and she would not erase herself again. The refusal landed with force not because it was loud but because it was final, and Ethan felt the strange impact of a limit he could not purchase away. He warned her then without threat but with blunt realism that the board would not protect her, and that inside his world she would be isolated, pressured, dissected, and blamed when resistance hardened against her presence. She replied that she had survived worse with less, and that fear would not be the principle guiding her decisions anymore. For a moment they stood facing one another, separated not by class but by opposing dependencies, he on control, she on meaning, and neither retreated because retreat would have reduced everything to transactions again. When she left the office with the provisional contract in her bag, the city below looked sharper, more precarious, as if every building carried new stakes that were no longer theoretical but tethered to her own fragile future. The next morning she entered the company as an employee, not a guest, and felt the invisible recalibration immediately, the way conversation softened when she passed the quiet pause before her name was spoken aloud, the faint hostility under professional courtesy that told her she had crossed from anomaly into intrusion. Ethan did not see her that day, but she felt his presence in the friction that delayed access to data in approvals, that stalled without reason in meetings she was not formally invited to but arrived at anyway because the work demanded it. By the end of the week, she realized the war had already begun, not with open conflict, but with subtle sabotage conducted through silence and omission, the most efficient tools of corporate violence. Yet amid the resistance, there were glimmers of cautious alignment, a senior engineer who whispered where to find archived learning loops, a compliance officer who forwarded anonymized reports without explanation, and a junior analyst who stayed late without being asked just to listen as she spoke. Through the patterns she was reconstructing from fragments. 3 weeks into her appointment, the board convened a special session without her name on the agenda, and when Ethan emerged afterward, his face carried a restraint she had learned to read as storm containment. He told her flatly that the board intended to neutralize her influence by burying her under peripheral tasks until her anomaly decayed into irrelevance, and that she should prepare for a long, slow suffocation. She answered with quiet resolve that suffocation only worked on people who stopped breathing. The data backed her up faster than resistance anticipated, because she moved with speed born from knowing that time itself was a weapon she could not afford to hand back. She reconstructed patient outcome drift across 3 hospital networks manually, when automated access was revoked, and when board analysts attempted to discredit her projections, she presented independent validations sourced from public health archives that could not be dismissed as internal fabrication. Each move they made to isolate her forced new exposure of their own structural blind spots, and the pattern repeated itself, like controlled detonation through layers of denial. Ethan watched the escalation from the center of power, where his signature still commanded doors, but his authority now fractured between two masters, bored loyalty and truth, made dangerous by her refusal to vanish. He found himself intervening not with overt defense but with selective enforcement, sustaining her access just long enough for her results to spill into rooms that could not ignore them. The threat to her did not soften when it shifted, it merely adapted, and the pressure became more personal when smear logic replaced technical objection, and whispers reached her that her rise was artificial, staged by intimacy with the CEO. She heard it first in a bathroom stall conversation, filtered through tile and fluorescence, and felt humiliation cut into her with sudden brutality, because it dressed her work in the oldest lie, used to dismiss women in power. That night, she considered quitting for the first time, not out of fear but out of exhaustion at the knowledge that no amount of data could fully shield her from narrative violence. Ethan sensed the fracture before she voiced it, not through affection but through deviation in her behavior, the slight tightening in her answers, the way she ended meetings early to avoid additional spectacle. He confronted her with controlled anger, demanding to know who had spoken, and she stared at him with a hardness he had not seen before, telling him that the rumor did not require a source because it lived comfortably in the structure they had all inherited and polished. The argument that followed was raw and unguarded, and for the first time, the barrier between CEO and analyst collapsed into two human beings, standing inside the wreckage of power and projection. He offered again in different words a way out, framed as insulation, protection, safety, and she answered that safety built on disappearance was not safety, it was surrender. When the shouting ended, neither felt victorious, and the space between them tightened into something undefined but potent, a tension seeded by conflict rather than desire. 2 nights later, the board delivered a formal directive, restricting Lila from the predictive architecture she had helped redesign, citing procedural compliance and risk oversight, and the blow landed harder than any insult because it severed her from the very system she had fought to improve. The next morning, she arrived to find her access revoked and her badge permissions downgraded without explanation, and she stood in the lobby staring at the silent gate that refused to open, as if the building itself had chosen a side. Ethan was in a closed session across the tower, negotiating acquisitions with men who believed her momentum could be erased with administrative efficiency, and by the time he reached her, the damage had already taken root. She did not cry in front of him because she had learned long ago which tears invited pity rather than respect, and she did not shout because outrage had already been taxed into uselessness. She simply stated that they had succeeded in making her work impossible, and that she would not beg for a gate to open when the room itself had declared that she did not belong. That night she packed her apartment into 2 suitcases, and prepared to return to the diner, not because she believed defeat was deserved, but because survival required distance from a battlefield that bled her energy without reward. Ethan found out only when her number went to voicemail, and the quiet realization struck him with a weight he could not calculate, because for the first time, the loss was not theoretical. The security gate at the tower rejected Ethan Caldwell's access card for the first time in his career, not with a red light, but with a silent pause that stretched long enough for 3 junior analysts to notice and look away, pretending nothing had happened while the system recalibrated his authority. It opened a second later, yet the message was clear: power inside his own empire had shifted, and the board was no longer waiting for his reactions before moving pieces. By noon, the press received anonymous leaks about internal conflicts over data ethics framed as instability in leadership, and by evening, investors were requesting emergency briefings that framed concern as loyalty but tasted like threat. Across the city, Lila sat in the back booth of the diner, tying her apron with hands that had not shaken once during the entire storm, because resignation had a strange clarity when survival returned to its oldest shape. Plates moved through her fingers again, coffee orders stacked in muscle memory, and the rhythm felt humiliating only until she noticed that humiliation now hurt less than the silence she had endured inside the tower. Yet the war followed her even into this familiar noise, because notifications burned across her discarded phone from engineers, asking where she had gone, from analysts whispering that the board was scrubbing her name from reports as if neutralizing memory itself could repair structural fault. Ethan arrived at the diner just after midnight, without security, without pretense, and for the first time without certainty, because the war had crossed from abstract dominance into personal loss. He waited at the counter until she noticed him, and when she did not smile, he realized that this battlefield would not bend to authority either. They spoke in fragments, low voices, wrapped in the hiss of grills and clatter of dishes, as she told him exactly how the board had stripped her access, isolated her presence, and redirected her work to a reconstruction team loyal not to truth, but to valuation optics. He told her the board had invoked emergency power clauses that allowed them to override executive discretion under crisis justification, and that every attempt he made to reinstate her credentials triggered deeper resistance that revealed a faction far more entrenched than he had suspected. The war was no longer about one position, it was about who defined the future architecture of human data inside a system that governed life itself. Lila offered no consolation and no plan, only the truth that she could build outside faster than they could erase her inside, and that the board corruption relied on centralized blindness, a weakness she could exploit if she chose to. Return. Ethan listened to her like a strategist, listening to another who had no need to impress him, and for the first time, the idea struck him with terrifying clarity that he no longer understood the system he had built better than her. By morning, 3 hospital networks began reporting unexplained cascade failures in predictive throughput identical to the fault lines Lila had warned about weeks earlier, and the reconstruction team scrambled to patch surface outputs without addressing core instability. Loss began compounding not in dollars first but in lives flagged too late for intervention, and when the first medical audit surfaced with her original projections buried in archived warnings, the media shifted from rumor to stake investigation. The board called an emergency session excluding Ethan and named an interim operations authority drawn from its own ranks, locking him out of critical system access under procedural legality, and the act detonated across internal channels. Like a coup executed with spreadsheets instead of weapons. Within hours, compliance teams descended into server rooms, quarantining logs, rewriting access history, and Lila watched it unfold from public terminals with a focus colder than rage, because now the battlefield was open. She began reconstructing the architecture again, using only mirrored data streams and hospital side logs, reaching out to the professor who validated her months earlier, and to 2 engineers who still trusted her enough to risk careers for truth. Together they began assembling a parallel audit trail mapping, where the reconstruction team had diverted ethical safeguards to accelerate performance optics at the cost of statistical resilience. The board responded with silencers, not threats but efficiencies, freezing contracts, reassigning departments, shrinking dissent through erosion rather than confrontation. Ethan moved through the chaos like a man discovering he had been a figurehead inside his own fortress, as every executive he summoned produced procedural barriers with hollow apologies and legal insulation studied enough to block every immediate path he attempted. For the first time since inheriting the company, he faced the reality that ownership without narrative control was illusion, and that the board had learned to weaponize the very governance he had trusted as protection. When he reached for Lila again, she had already moved beyond the diner into borrowed spaces, where screens glowed in borrowed offices, mapping system failure with the quiet urgency of people who know history will not wait for permission. The war turned public when a hospital error escalated into national coverage, and journalists traced the predictive inconsistency to a quiet overhaul signed by a board subcommittee 2 weeks after Lila removal. Ethan walked into the press briefing uninvited and stood before his own company emblem, as if stepping into crossfire, delivering a statement that acknowledged systemic failure and named ethical compromise without admitting personal defeat. The board retaliated within minutes by announcing an independent executive review of his leadership, framed as a stability measure that activated market alarms, with clinical precision sending valuation into sharp oscillation. Investors demanded accountability, regulators demanded access, and Ethan realized the paradox too late. The system he had built to move without delay now moved against him faster than thought. Lila released the parallel audit at dawn, not to the press but to federal oversight backed by validated cross-references, patient outcome correlations, and internal approval timelines that closed every escape hatch the board had left for itself. The strike landed silently at first, then erupted through sealed offices, as subpoenas triggered automatic disclosure protocols that even the board could not override without exposing criminal obstruction. Panic fractured inside the tower, and executives who had spent decades mastering control now ran blind through corridors where every door carried legal consequence. Engineers loyal to Lila fed data directly to investigators, while Reconstruction architects vanished into legal counsels and resignation clauses that no longer shielded them. Ethan walked back into the tower that evening, not as conqueror, but as witness to the implosion of a power structure that had mistaken invisibility for invincibility. He found Lila in the temporary forensic operations floor, not in command, not in retreat, but in precise motion inside consequence, and when their eyes met across the glowing grid of exposed systems, neither spoke because language felt insufficient beside what had actually occurred. The board-corrupt faction was suspended by midnight, the interim authority revoked, and federal oversight installed under emergency biomedical risk statutes that transferred operational command back to the executive under monitored conditions. The war had not ended, but the front line had shifted from clandestine erosion to visible reckoning, and for the first time since it began, Ethan felt not control but alignment returning with terrifying cost. Yet victory tasted bitter, because it arrived wrapped in scrutiny, layoffs, asset freezes, public doubt, and the unrelenting realization that empire could not be rebuilt with trust alone. As dawn crept across the glass facade, the tower did not glow with triumph, but with exposed circuitry of a system forced into honest shape by a waitress who refused to disappear. Federal oversight changed the air inside the tower faster than any renovation ever could, because power now moved through visible channels instead of hidden favors, and every signature carried consequence that could not be quietly erased. Lila worked inside a temporary command floor surrounded by auditors, engineers, and compliance officers who treated truth like a fragile material that had to be handled with both speed and care. She no longer needed permission to access core architecture, yet the weight of that access pressed heavier than any denial had, because now every miscalculation would echo beyond reputation into measurable lives. Ethan moved through parallel streams of crisis, with investors, regulators, and media forming a perimeter of containment around what remained of the company credibility, while internally the system convulsed under exposure like an organism forced to confront its own buried infection. The board reconvened under federal supervision, stripped of its shadow authority, yet still clinging to old hierarchies through language, posture, and thinly veiled resentment, aimed squarely at the woman who had dismantled them without ever seeking permission. Lila presented her project proposal not as a rescue fantasy, but as a controlled reconstruction plan built on data survivability, patient safety, and long-horizon stability, with explicit acceptance of reduced short-term revenue as the cost of ethical repair. The room resisted instinctively because resistance was muscle memory, but the data left no free space to argue, and when the professor validated her staging logic line by line, even the most entrenched directors shifted from dismissal to hostility disguised as concern. Ethan remained silent throughout the presentation, allowing the project to stand without his authority, because he understood too well that his voice would only contaminate its legitimacy now. When the final slide resolved into projected recovery curves, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, the skepticism fractured not into trust, but into forced acknowledgement that the alternative was public collapse. A vote was called under oversight rules, and the project passed with a margin too narrow to celebrate, but wide enough to bind. The board attempted to dilute her leadership by proposing a supervisory layer above her authority, and Lila refused without apology, stating that redundancy at this level would erase accountability rather than protect it, and that she would not accept leadership framed as symbolic. The tension rose sharp in public, and finally, the chair approved her principal authority under monitored conditions because the room had no appetite left for disguise. Within 48 hours, the reconstruction began, and resistance manifested not through open obstruction but through friction delays, procurement bottlenecks, legal caution that weaponized patience against urgency. Lila countered each with operational bypasses, built from her years of improvisation under scarcity, and her team learned quickly that her methods were not chaotic, they were adaptive in ways centralized systems feared, because they could not be predicted easily enough to be controlled. Ethan watched from the edge of his own company, gradually retrieving executive function, not through brute authority, but through alignment with the transparency now demanded by oversight, and something inside him shifted from dominance to stewardship, because the war had stripped arrogance from its protective illusion. 3 weeks into reconstruction, a secondary crisis erupted when a rival conglomerate announced a conditional acquisition proposal to absorb Caldwell Systems under the narrative of stabilization and market rescue. The offer carried survival optics for investors and annihilation certainty for independent governance, and the board divided instantly along familiar fault lines between immediate gain and long-term consequence. Lila recognized the acquisition as a hostile sterilization of her work, disguised as benevolence, because the first action demanded under integration would be to sunset her adaptive architecture in favor of uniform control algorithms that ignored the very nonlinear risk structures she had fought to expose. Ethan rejected the proposal publicly within minutes, not as CEO defending turf, but as a man defending an emerging philosophy of power that no longer tolerated sacrifice as a hidden cost. The city reacted with volatility. Markets dipped, then rebounded as analysts struggled to model a company that now defied its own historical behavior. Behind closed doors, the board roared with fury, accusing him of emotional capture and strategic blindness. And for the first time, Ethan felt the urge not to appease but to confront, because the silence that once preserved him now tasted like collaboration in erosion. Lila met the acquisition threat not with rhetoric, but with the project advancing ahead of schedule, delivering early reductions in patient outcome error rates that exceeded even her conservative projections, and the data began circulating across oversight networks too fast for containment. Hospitals that had been preparing exit contingencies quietly renewed contracts at stabilized rates, restoring revenue flow not through dominance but through regained trust, and the market noticed the shift with cautious recalibration. The board attempted one final maneuver to reclaim narrative control by announcing an internal review of Lila leadership, framed as procedural compliance, but federal oversight rejected the request, citing conflict of interest, and the humiliation cut deeper than any regulatory fine they had endured. In a closed session, one director accused her of destabilizing the natural order of corporate hierarchy, and she answered without raising her voice that hierarchy without accountability was simply a slower name for collapse. Ethan witnessed the exchange and felt not pride but a sharp humility at how long it had taken him to see what she had always known, because survival had taught her what ownership had blinded him from. The acquisition threat dissolved within days when the rival firm withdrew under regulatory scrutiny, unwilling to expose its own opaque medical data practices to the light. Now fixed on Caldwell Systems, victory arrived again, not as triumph, but as space, the room to continue building without suffocation, and the board receded into constrained compliance bound by oversight and market gaze. Lila stood at the center of operational flow, directing layered recovery efforts with a calm born of living through worse than corporate chaos, and her team moved with the urgency of people who knew their work, now carried names, faces, futures instead of abstract optimization scores. Ethan found himself watching her not as anomaly or threat but as the axis around which a new version of his company was pivoting, and for the first time he recognized that the empire he had inherited was being transformed rather than preserved, and that transformation frightened him less than the prospect of returning to what it had been. The press circled constantly, constructing myths of defiance and romance and rebellion, but inside the command floor the work remained stubbornly unglamorous, governed by models, parameters, audits, and sleepless coordination. Lila collapsed into a chair one night at 2 a.m, staring at a trending stabilization curve that confirmed in quiet mathematics that they had crossed the threshold from emergency to controlled ascent, and the relief hit her not as joy but as sudden exhaustion so deep it frightened her. Ethan entered without warning, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and placed one beside her without comment, and the gesture felt more intimate than any word either of them had spoken, because it contained no transaction, only recognition of shared weight. They did not speak of the board that night, or of the acquisition threat, or of the looming legal aftermath, because some truths did not need articulation to be fully present. Outside the tower, the city continued its relentless indifference, but inside a different structure was taking shape, one not governed by silence, bought with fear but by friction, sustained by truth, and as the system stabilized under Lila, the board understood at last that the project had not merely saved their company, it had rewritten the rules by which it could ever again be owned. The first quiet evening arrived without announcement, like a conspiracy between exhaustion and relief, and when the command floor finally dimmed under reduced emergency lighting, Lila realized she had forgotten what it felt like to leave the building before midnight. She stepped into the elevator alone, with the echo of cooling servers fading behind her, and felt the unfamiliar sensation of space returning to her chest, now that every second no longer belonged to crisis. Outside the tower, the city breathed with ordinary indifference, and rain traced slow lines down the glass, as if time had softened just enough to be noticed again. Ethan waited near the curb, not with a driver or security detail, but with his sleeves rolled and his phone forgotten in his pocket, and when she saw him she almost turned back because the battlefield they had shared did not yet have language for whatever was waiting between them now. He asked if she had eaten, and she shook her head, and that was somehow enough to align their trajectories without further negotiation, as they walked 2 blocks to a quiet restaurant where space mattered less than proximity, and no one knew their names. The table they chose was small, the menu simple, the light warm in a way that could not be leveraged for valuation, and for the first time since the war began they spoke without systems between their sentences. He told her how the board had started calling him unpredictable, and she laughed softly at the careful absurdity of men who had never confused domination with stability until now. She asked him what it felt like to be watched by regulators, and he admitted it felt like being seen for the first time without illusion, which was both terrifying and clarifying in equal measure. Silence settled between them not as a gap but as a held breath, and for several seconds neither spoke, because words felt too heavy for the newly fragile weight of unguarded presence. When their hands brushed accidentally across the table, it sent a quiet shock through both of them, not with heat but with recognition. Because this was not transaction or rebellion or defiance. This was simply human contact arriving in space defined by control. The connection did not erupt into confession or visible longing, it settled into something more dangerous, because it was gentle and unannounced, like gravity drawing 2 bodies closer without asking permission. Days passed and the rhythm changed subtly, not in schedule but in attention, because Ethan began to notice details. He once filtered out the way Lila tucked her hair behind her ear when calculations grew dense, the faint pause before she entered a contentious meeting, as if aligning her breath with resistance, the quiet humor she carried through disaster without spectacle. Lila noticed the shifts in him as well, the unguarded questions that replaced directives, the moments where he admitted uncertainty without performing strength, the way he watched her not to measure outcomes but to understand process. It unsettled her because intimacy without possession did not fit any pattern she had learned to survive. Yet the battlefield did not pause for personal reckoning, and love entered not as refuge but as interference, as emotion collided with strategy in ways neither of them could simulate away. A new board challenge surfaced, framed as oversight expansion, that would fold her project under a multi-tier executive committee, effectively neutralizing her authority through dilution, and Ethan pushed back with uncharacteristic ferocity. Because the move was not simply structural, it was punitive and targeted, and the room felt the shift instantly. When he met her afterward, his anger burned not with ego, but with protective instinct, and that frightened them both, because protection was the seed of attachment, and attachment created vulnerability inside systems trained to exploit it. Rumors grew louder outside the tower, feeding on proximity, misreading coordination as romance, and when an analyst openly questioned whether her influence blurred executive judgment, Ethan shut the conversation down with surgical intensity that left silence smoking in its wake. Lila confronted him later, telling him that defense from power only reinforced the narrative they feared, and that she could not afford to be framed as his liability when she had spent her life proving she was her own force. The argument that followed was sharp, not cruel but precise. As they exposed the lines, neither of them yet knew how to navigate between partnership and independence, desire and authority, survival and surrender. He told her he did not know how to protect something without controlling it, and she told him she did not know how to accept care without fearing it would become a lever. They stood there in the aftermath of truth, with their reflections fractured in the glass behind them, recognizing in each other not obstacles but mirrors. The second dinner was announced publicly as a benefit event designed to restore brand trust under regulatory supervision, and the irony of their first meeting returning under a different name did not pass unnoticed between them. This time she did not attend as decoration but as lead architect of the project that had carried the company back from collapse, and when Ethan offered his arm at the entrance, the gesture felt ceremonial rather than directive. Inside, the crowd shifted in a new way, leaning not with casual disdain but with cautious respect, and when he introduced her with her full name and role, the words landed with weight, because names had been denied to her once before in rooms like this. The conversation did not circle labor with impunity this time, and when someone attempted to reduce human cost to margin erosion, the room corrected itself with a swiftness that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Lila felt the echo of a door closing on an old world, and the opening of another whose shape was still unknown but undeniably different. They danced once, not for cameras, not for optics, but because the music reached them before the fear did, and in that movement, she felt the truth she had been avoiding settle into her bones with calm inevitability. She had crossed from resistance into attachment, and there was no formula to retreat back across that boundary without damage. Ethan felt it too in the way her presence rearranged his internal map, not as conquest but as orientation, and the realization dismantled him quietly, because it meant the empire he had built no longer defined the edges of meaning. When the night ended, he walked her to the curb, the city loud and indifferent again, and for a long moment neither moved because the next step no longer belonged to strategy but to choice. He asked if he could kiss her with a softness that startled her more than any command ever had, and she answered not with words, but by closing the distance herself, because courage no longer needed justification. The kiss was not urgent, it was cautious and real, the kind built not on desperation but on confirmation, and when they parted there was no illusion left to preserve, only a truth that had already reshaped the battlefield. The morning after arrived without absolution because the world did not pause for personal clarity, and inside the tower power remained contested narratives, still fought for dominance, and the board watched their proximity with renewed calculation. Ethan entered her office, carrying 2 coffees again, but this time he hesitated at the threshold, as if recognizing that what they now shared could not cross every boundary intact. She accepted the cup with a faint smile that carried both promise and warning, and in that small exchange they both understood that love had entered the battlefield, not as sanctuary, but as liability and strength woven together in unknown ratio. By afternoon, the board scheduled a closed session to discuss executive conduct under heightened scrutiny, and the timing was not subtle. Lila felt the familiar pull of near surrender rise again, not because she doubted the work, but because she understood the peculiar cruelty of systems that punished attachment as weakness, while trading in loyalty as currency. Ethan prepared for the session, knowing the invisible verdict already forming beyond procedure, and when he looked back at her across the divide of corridor and glass, he saw not a subordinate, not a partner, not a rebel, but the axis around which his future had pivoted without negotiation. The war had taught them how to stand against power together, but love now asked whether they could stand against power without consuming each other, and neither yet knew the answer with the clarity demanded by consequence. The threat arrived, dressed as rescue, with language polished to calm markets and soothe fear, and when the announcement broke before sunrise, it moved faster than denial could form, because the rival conglomerate framed the proposal as a stabilizing integration engineered to protect patients, preserve jobs, and restore investor trust after months of regulatory shock. By the time Lila reached the tower, the news had saturated every screen, and corridor conversations already tilted with the quiet panic of people who understood that mergers rarely saved workers and almost never protected the ideas that made institutions worth saving. The offer outlined a full acquisition with transitional governance that would migrate core systems into a unified architecture under the rival firm command, and the line that cut deepest sat buried in appendix language stating that all experimental redevelopment frameworks would be reviewed for alignment with legacy optimization standards. Lila did not need a legal briefing to understand that sentence meant her work would be sunset, and the nonlinear safeguards she had built would be flattened into standardized control models that erased the very conditions that had exposed the original failure. Ethan convened an emergency executive briefing under oversight rules, with regulators and board members present, and the room vibrated with staged calm, as if posture itself might absorb impact. The rival firm representative spoke first, projecting charts of projected valuation, recovery, workforce realignment, and integrated efficiency gains, with voices practiced in the art of making erasure sound like continuity. When they reached the workforce slide, the number that mattered appeared in a softened font. 500 roles identified for strategic redundancy in the first tranche, and every eye flicked to Lila because everyone in that room knew whose work those jobs depended on. Ethan interrupted the presentation, not with outrage but with a question that cut to the architecture, asking how their integration model handled nonlinear patient risk under compounded socioeconomic stress. The rival chief architect answered with the confidence of legacy dominance, stating that uniform control reduced variance, and that variance was the enemy of scalability. The room leaned into the exchange with the hunger of power, watching power test itself, and Lila felt the heat rise again, not as anger but as dread, because she had lived inside the tail of that variance and knew exactly who was consumed when it was negated for efficiency. She requested the floor not as an analyst but as the architect of the only system presently stabilizing the collapse networks, and she spoke with the quiet authority of documentation behind every word, demonstrating precisely where uniformity collapsed under extreme input conditions and how the rival model generated blind spots that no aggregation layer could compensate for under time pressure. The rival team deflected by reframing the risks as acceptable trade-offs for broader accessibility, and Lila responded by projecting case clusters already stabilized by her adaptive architecture that would have been misclassified under their fillet schema with fatal consequence. Silence sharpened and regulators leaned forward as the exchange shifted from optics into proof. The board watched, not as arbiters now but as men and women trapped between valuation, appetite, and the public consequence they could no longer pretend was theoretical. The rival chief negotiator pivoted elegantly, stating that all concerns would be resolved during post-merger integration, and that immediate acceptance was required to prevent further market erosion, implying that hesitation itself might trigger a sell-off that would devastate shareholder confidence. Ethan recognized the maneuver for what it was, a coercive timeline designed to compress doubt into surrender, and responded by requesting a 24-hour review period under oversight statute, knowing the rival firm would either agree and reveal overconfidence or refuse and expose predatory intent. They agreed, and the war moved once more from public theater into closed calculation. Lila gathered her team within minutes, and the work began with the merciless clarity of people who understood that the next day would decide whether their months of reconstruction would become legacy or footnote. They mapped redundancy scenarios, workforce displacement thresholds, and systemic rollback consequences with the same precision they had once reserved for life-saving architecture, because jobs were not abstract either. They were rent, tuition, and medication, and dignity translated into dinner tables across the city. At midnight, Ethan joined them without announcement, not as CEO issuing directives, but as another set of eyes willing to shoulder gravity, and the room shifted subtly under the significance of his presence, because this time he arrived without performance-only resolve. He listened as Lila dissected the merger implications with stark honesty, and when she finished, he surprised her by asking what she thought they should do without bias to his position. The question carried risk, because it surrendered control of the narrative to truth, and she felt the weight of delivering an answer that could dismantle everything he had built, or leave it hollowed but standing. She told him the merger would preserve the shell of his empire, but destroy its soul, that 500 workers would lose their livelihoods within 6 months, that patient error would climb again after the integration veneer cracked, and that her project would be recoded into compliance theater for a machine that required silence to function. He absorbed the answer without flinch, and nodded once slowly, because he had already reached the same conclusion, and the alignment between them felt both terrifying and necessary. By morning, the rival firm returned for the decision, and the city held its breath as markets hovered at the cliff edge of reaction. The board chair spoke of responsibility and stability, rehearsing the comfort language of inevitability, and Ethan stood to deliver the refusal with an evenness that carried finality because it had been stripped of hope for compromise. He stated that the company would not surrender its core patient safety architecture to a model that prioritized uniform efficiency over adaptive truth, and that the layoffs implied by the integration contradicted every value the company now defended under oversight. The rival negotiator smiled thinly and responded with warning rather than persuasion, stating that market response would be unforgiving and that competitors would feast on the weakness of idealism. Ethan replied that he had already watched idealism die once in silence, and that the price of preventing that death again was one he accepted without negotiation. The announcement hit the markets within seconds, and volatility surged as predicted, with commentators dividing instantly between those who saw courage and those who saw unforced error. Inside, the tower reactions fractured along older lines: fear, anger, relief, and a strange emerging loyalty among workers who understood that a line had been drawn not for optics, but for them. By afternoon, 3 major institutional investors moved to exit, threatening a liquidity cascade that could have triggered the very collapse the merger claimed to prevent, and Ethan felt the cold weight of consequence press against his chest, because this war no longer threatened only the work, it threatened the company's survival. Lila watched the numbers with him in real time, and for the first time since she had entered his world, she questioned whether truth could endure when it demanded too much at once. When the fifth exit alert sounded, she closed her eyes briefly and felt the pull of near surrender return, not as fear for herself, but as terror for the 500 lives suspended in the architecture she had helped build. The board seized the moment to call for an immediate emergency reversal vote, citing fiduciary duty and survival imperative, and the room ignited with urgency calibrated to crush dissent. Ethan held the line, requesting a final disclosure before any reversal, and ordered the release of full patient outcome stabilization data under federal oversight to the public quadrant of market media, where it could not be quietly buried. The data exploded outward with the force of undeniable truth, and within minutes hospitals across 3 states issued independent statements confirming the decline in critical misclassification rates since the deployment of Lila architecture. The narrative shifted visibly under the glare of corroboration, and investors paused as the story reframed from instability to unprecedented transparency. Yet the reprieve did not halt the tidal danger, because markets punished unpredictability, whether it came wrapped in truth or fear, and the company's share price cratered into violation thresholds that triggered automatic covenant reviews. Beneath the financial freefall, the human cost sharpened as department heads prepared contingency lists for workforce reduction in case liquidity failed, and the 500 names became scrolls of unchosen catastrophe, waiting to be written with ink of necessity. That night, Lila walked the silent rows of offices after midnight, reading the names on temporary lists, pinned to glass walls, and for the first time since the war began, she felt the inadequacy of intellect alone, because numbers could not bargain for people whose lives had already narrowed to this single axis of survival. Ethan found her there, standing between 2 columns of fluorescent light, with the names reflected endlessly in glass, and the weight of them bent his shoulders lower than any board confrontation ever had. She told him plainly that the merger threat had not ended, because the rival firm would return when weakness deepened, and that if liquidity vanished, the choice would not belong to principles, but to arithmetic. He answered that he knew, and that he had never been more afraid of a calculation. The night stretched with unanswered equations, and by dawn, the company stood suspended between collapse and endurance, with markets waiting for the next signal that would declare which side of history the future had selected. The crisis reached its breaking point under white lights and live cameras as the regulators called an emergency public disclosure session in the central atrium of the tower, where workers stood shoulder to shoulder behind glass barriers, and media waited like a held breath for either a collapse or a confession that would decide the fate of the company and the 500 names hanging in limbo. And Ethan arrived, not as a shielded executive, but alone in the center aisle, with the board on one side, the employees on the other, and the weight of every prior decision he had ever made pressing against his back like the echo of an empire, demanding a verdict. Lila stood within the operations platform among auditors and engineers, watching data streams flicker across projection walls as liquidity alarms pulsed red and amber, while social response metrics spiked outside in equal measure, because truth had provoked belief, and belief now demanded survival. And when she saw Ethan step forward without counsel, without prepared speech, she felt the strange certainty that something irreversible had crossed the final boundary between strategy and surrender. He spoke first of the merger refusal and the investor exits, not as heroic defiance, but as consequence owned without insulation, stating that the price of rejecting the acquisition had been immediate and brutal, and that the market had punished the company for unpredictability, even when that unpredictability had been engineered in service of human life rather than short-term margin preservation. He then asked for the release of the full stabilization archive, not only the portions that favored the recovery narrative, but every line of data, including early failures and internal warnings, that bore his signature, because accountability could not be curated without becoming another performance. The disclosure unfolded live, with auditors' narration verifying what Lila had fought to protect and what the board had attempted to bury, and as patient outcome curves stabilized on screen, alongside early misclassification spikes, the room felt the moral temperature shift from spectacle into weight, because the truth refused to remain an abstraction when names and dates and thresholds were spoken out loud. The board attempted to interrupt with legal framing, but Ethan cut through with a singular statement that the company would accept every regulatory burden and personal liability associated with the transformation, but would not reverse the architecture that had saved lives in service of market comfort. And in that moment, the empire he had inherited fell apart around him, not with noise but with a clean structural sound, as if a corrupt beam had finally been removed. Market feeds erupted in real time with violent swings as speculation raced the disclosure narrative, and Lila watched the liquidity index dip again into breach, as automatic covenant conditions triggered across debt instruments that did not care about ethics or courage, and for the first time, she felt the terrible clarity that what they had won in principle might be lost in arithmetic anyway, because the future could be stolen, not by malice but by math without conscience. Ethan turned then not to the board, not to the cameras, but to the workers behind the glass, and said openly that the 500 positions at risk would not be traded as negotiating currency, nor postponed into quiet erasure after the news cycle passed. And he committed on record that the executive tier, including himself, would absorb the financial shock through compensation, forfeiture, and asset liquidation to stabilize payroll until new financing could be secured or the company failed, with its people intact. The declaration struck the room into shocked stillness, because wealth had rarely been spoken as something to be spent downward rather than guarded upward, and for a fraction of a second the machinery of valuation hesitated under the intrusion of sacrificial logic. Lila felt the tremor then not in the projections but in herself, because she had never allowed herself to believe that power could kneel to consequence without demanding replacement dominion in return. And as Ethan stepped away from the podium, the reality of what he had just offered began to spread through the crowd like a slow wave of disbelief turning into fragile alignment. The board chair stood to object, invoking fiduciary abandonment and breach of market duty, but the regulators overrode the protest with procedural control, citing extraordinary public interest and measurable patient risk as sufficient grounds for intervention and temporary governance suspension. And the tower witnessed the unprecedented spectacle of an empire placed under temporary receivership, not by collapse but by moral declaration, that could not be immediately disassembled. Investors moved again, some in retreat, some in speculative return as the narrative fractured into competing futures, and Lila felt the awful vertigo of standing inside a decision whose full cost would not reveal itself for months. And when her terminals flashed a provisional stabilization of payroll projections, she exhaled for the first time since the merger threat emerged, because the 500 names slipped out of immediate free fall and into a narrow corridor of conditional survival. The atrium erupted then not in applause but in something more disorganized and human, a mixture of stunned relief, restrained cheers, and quiet tears from people who understood how close they had been to erasure without ceremony. And through it, Ethan stood alone in the center of the floor, no longer shielded by structure or status, only by consequence, assumed without guarantee of rescue. Lila moved through the crowd toward him with the slow certainty of someone approaching not a victory but the point where all defenses are laid down without negotiation. And when she stood before him, the sound of the room receded into a dull echo, because what waited between them could not be translated into policy or press language. He looked at her then, not as architect, not as ally, but as the axis on which every choice of the past months had turned, and for the first time since he had known her, his voice carried no calculation as he told her that he had built his life on command and control, and had mistaken both for safety, until she had shattered the illusion with a clarity he could neither dominate nor dismiss. The cameras caught the moment, but could not decode it as he stepped back one pace and then another, and lowered himself to his knees on the cold stone floor before her, not as performance, not as display, but as an act so stripped of defense that the room fell silent in recognition of its authenticity. He said that the empire he had offered to sacrifice moments earlier was the lesser surrender, and that what he asked for now was not alliance, not endurance, not strategic partnership, but the chance to choose her without ownership claims or power leverage, because everything else in his life had already proven how easily it could be taken. Lila felt the shock of the gesture rip through every scar she carried, because no calculation prepared her for a man whose power had moved markets bending instead to a truth without spectators, even as the world watched. And for a moment she could not answer, because the weight of being chosen without being possessed recalibrated every survival instinct she had ever learned. She knelt then too, not to meet him in symmetry, but to erase the gulf that hierarchy had carved between them, and placed her hands on his face with a steadiness that surprised even her, because fear had finally lost its authority over that simple motion. She told him she did not believe in salvation or vows spoken at the height of crisis, but that she believed in the work they had done together, and in the man who had chosen to dismantle the machinery that had once protected him at the expense of others, and if he was asking for a life, rather than a spectacle, she would meet him only on the condition that neither of them would ever again mistake love for leverage. He accepted without negotiation, and when she lifted him back to his feet, the crowd exhaled as if a collective breath long held had finally been released into the ordinary air of consequence, where choices become futures without guarantee of kindness. The regulators closed the session within minutes, and the media storm reignited outside, but inside the tower the axis had already shifted, and what remained was not victory, not defeat, but the strange quiet that follows the surrender of old laws. Later that night, as offices emptied and the city resumed its indifferent roar, Ethan and Lila stood alone again in the operations corridor where weeks earlier names had glowed like elegies on glass, and now the lists were gone, replaced by active schedules and delayed fears that promised no rest, but offered endurance. He asked her without ceremony if she would marry him, not as a solution, not as a consolidation, but as a confession delivered without shield, and she did not answer immediately because yes, spoken too quickly would have betrayed the gravity of how far they had already come without contracts. When she finally spoke, it was to tell him that love was not the end of this war, but another front that demanded equal honesty and sacrifice, and that she would accept only with the knowledge that both of them would fail at times, and choose, again without assurance of simplicity. He answered that the night he knelt had already taught him that certainty was the illusion, and that choice renewed under consequence was the only power left worth claiming. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the private revolution that had just rewritten 2 lives inside glass and stone, and within the tower the empire that had once measured only profit now stood recalibrated around a different arithmetic, where loss and loyalty and courage shared the same ledger, without pretending to cancel each other out. The morning after the night, everything changed, arrived without ceremony, and that was how Lila knew the world had truly shifted, because revolutions that endure do not announce themselves, they simply continue under new rules that feel ordinary only after you have survived their cost. The tower opened with regulated calm under receivership oversight, and the hallways filled with the low, steady sound of work that no longer ran on fear alone. Payroll stabilized under the emergency financing framework Ethan had secured through asset liquidation and deferred compensation, and the 500 names that once hovered on glass walls now moved again through real corridors attached to living schedules and uncertain but extant futures. Lila returned to the command floor not as anomaly, not as threat, but as architect with full authority codified under federal supervision, and the permanence of that role struck her with a quiet heaviness because legacy is never as light as ambition imagines it to be. Over the following weeks, the adaptive architecture expanded across 3 additional states under rolling audits, and the data did what it had always promised. When given room to breathe, patient misclassification rates continued to fall, recovery time indexes showed early signs of nonlinear stabilization that no uniform model had ever achieved. The board remained under watch, reshaped by resignation and removal, until those who remained learned to speak a different language in rooms, once governed by erasure, and the shift did not make them noble, but it made them accountable, which was more than most systems ever demanded. Ethan worked without spectacle in the margins of these transformations, negotiating debt, realignment, and external partnerships with the discipline of a man who had learned that trust traveled faster than fear when evidence followed behind it. The press attempted to fashion romance into narrative currency, but both of them refused the reduction because memory still held the weight of nights where courage had not yet learned how to look like devotion. They did not announce an engagement, and they did not avoid the question, either choosing instead the slower honesty of walking forward without turning choice into spectacle. One evening, as the city leaned into early summer light, Lila returned alone to the diner where everything had begun, and stood for a moment at the counter where she once tied her apron each night, preparing to be invisible. The owner recognized her with quiet astonishment that did not ask for proof, and she ordered coffee with the same weary precision she had once used to survive, and this time sat at the corner booth, not out of refuge, but out of remembrance. When the waitress brought the cup, Lila met her eyes, and saw the same controlled fatigue and filtered intelligence that once lived in her own reflection, and she asked the woman what she studied when no one was watching. The answer came hesitant, then brave: physics, and the words landed like a key turning in a door Lila had never been able to forget. 2 months later, the first Caldwell Monroe Scholarship recipients were announced under a foundation that bore no board branding and no marketing masquerade, only the names of students whose lives would tilt gently, rather than violently away, from the brink that had once consumed her. The Foundation Charter specified long horizon allocation for under-resourced students in data science engineering and applied mathematics with protected funding against market volatility, so that the mistake of conditional generosity could never again disguise itself as opportunity. Ethan signed the charter quietly without photographers, and when he handed Lila the final document, he did not frame it as a gift, but as a responsibility shared, because leadership without distribution had already proven what it cost to acquire. Pretend power could hoard meaning without consequence. Their relationship unfolded in the ordinary spaces between crisis dinners and compliance reviews, with the awkward tenderness of two people who had never learned how to be simple without performing, and who now taught each other slowly how to rest inside choice without needing to defend it. They argued without cruelty and negotiated without scripts, because the battlefield had already stripped away the illusion that silence preserved harmony, and love did not arrive as rescue, but as sustained practice beneath shared obligation. The first time they spoke of marriage again, it was in a narrow kitchen after midnight, with coffee left unattended as rain threaded against the windows, and the question carried none of the adrenaline of public surrender, only the quiet recognition that a life chosen without leverage asked for a vow that could endure the days when courage felt ordinary and fatigue felt limitless. They married months later without a press release in the same city that once tried to consume them through glass and valuation, choosing a ceremony that fit inside belonging rather than spectacle. And when Lila walked down the aisle, she did not feel the echo of the waitress who had once borrowed a dress to be tolerated, but the presence of every choice that had refused erasure and built something unrepeatable in its place. The company continued not as paradise but as narrative transformed into discipline, where oversight remained vigilant, and profit accepted its boundary beneath patient safety and workforce continuity, and the markets adjusted with reluctant respect to a model that resisted being flattened into the old language of dominance. Some investors never returned, and some employees left as well, because revolutions create dissonance as much as alignment, and the myth that all change unites is another comfort story systems tell to avoid remaining honest. Lila accepted the losses as she accepted the gains, with an equal measure of clarity, because meaning had never been symmetrical, and permanence had always been conditional on choosing again after the applause ended. Years later, when the foundation expanded beyond the company into public alliances, an auditorium filled with recipients who did not yet know how heavy the word legacy could be, and she stood at the podium, remembering the night she had once been asked to sit silently beside power for the price of survival. She told them that intelligence without access starves quietly, and that courage without protection bleeds unseen, but that when the two are allowed to meet under shared accountability, they change not only outcomes, but the rules by which outcomes are decided. Ethan watched from the back, not as patron but as participant, in the long tale of a decision that had once bent him to his knees, without knowing what would rise in its place. Afterward, they returned to the diner together, not for ceremony, but because memory asked to be honored in ordinary ways that did not require witnesses, and they sat in the same booth with 2 cups of coffee between them, and the world moved past the windows, with its ordinary indifference untouched by how far 2 lives had traveled inside it. Lila reached across the table, and for a moment neither spoke, because the distance they had crossed no longer needed narration, and the waitress who brought their order did not know the history she served between them, only that 2 people held hands without disguise and paid with gratitude that did not perform for anyone else. Legacy, in the end, did not take the shape of monuments or headlines. It settled into scholarships, renewed each year, projects audited without fear, and a marriage built not on rescue, but on mutual witness to the cost of choosing truth when silence would have been safer. And somewhere in the quiet arithmetic of the city, a former waitress became the axis of systems she had once been taught to accept as immovable, not because she conquered them, but because she refused to disappear when they told her she belonged only as decoration. If this story moved something inside you, do not just close the screen and walk away, because stories like this only live when they connect real hearts across real distance, and someone somewhere right now is standing at the same edge Lila once stood at, wondering if their intelligence, their courage, their voice will ever be seen in a world that prefers silence. If you believe that truth can still bend power, if you believe that love built on respect can survive pressure that crushes empires, then this story is already part of you, and now it is your turn to choose what you do with it. Tap the like button, not for the algorithm alone, but as a signal that stories of dignity still matter. Share this video with someone who once felt invisible and needs to be reminded that erasure is not destiny. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and what moment in this story hit you the hardest. Was it the first $10,000 offer, the boardroom explosion, the night he knelt, or the quiet return to the diner at the end? Every voice strengthens this community, and every story you share gives someone else the courage to step forward without permission. If you want more stories like this billionaire romance built on intelligence and sacrifice, not beauty and shortcuts, then subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next journey. We are building a place here for people who believe that love should challenge power, not hide behind it. And if you stayed until this very last word, you are already part of that circle. Now, answer one simple question in the comments. Would you have taken the $10,000 that first night, or would you have walked away? And why? Your answer might be the beginning of someone else's story.